To understand why Ignaz Schwinn built what he built, you have to understand the world he left behind. The German state of Württemberg, in the 1860s and 1870s, was a place of extraordinary craft traditions and suffocating social hierarchy. Master craftsmen passed their trades to their sons. Workshop apprentices spent years learning under strict supervision before they were permitted to touch a finished product on their own. The culture of precision that defined German manufacturing in that era was real and deep, but it existed within a rigid social order that made advancement almost impossible for those who were not born into the right families. Ignaz Schwinn was born in the town of Hartheim in 1860. His father was a tradesman of modest means. From an early age, Ignaz demonstrated the kind of methodical intelligence that German technical schools were designed to cultivate. A mind that wanted to know not just how things worked, but why they worked, and how they might be made to work better. He pursued training as a mechanical engineer, and by his mid-20s he was employed in German factories producing the industrial machinery that was making Germany one of the great manufacturing powers of the 19th century. He was good at his work, possibly very good. But Germany in the 1880s was full of good engineers, and the pathways upward were controlled by connections, credentials, and class distinctions that a young man from Hartheim without influential patrons could not easily navigate. Ignaz could see the ceiling above him. It was not very far away. Meanwhile, the stories coming back from America were remarkable. Men who had emigrated with nothing were writing home about wages, about opportunity, about a country where the question people asked you was not who your family was, but what you could do. These were not all true stories. The reality of immigrant life in industrial America was considerably harder than the letters home suggested, but they contained enough truth to make a man of Ignaz's temperament take them seriously. The bicycle was, at this moment, the most exciting mechanical innovation in everyday life. The first practical chain-driven bicycle, the design we would recognize today, had been developed in Britain in 1885. By the late 1880s, bicycle manufacturing was spreading across Europe and beginning to take hold in America. Ignaz, trained in precision mechanics, understood immediately what a bicycle was. A machine of considerable complexity that required consistent quality in every component to function safely and reliably. It was exactly the kind of problem his mind was built to solve. In 1891. At the age of 31, Ignaz Schwinn booked passage to America. He had no relatives waiting for him, no employer lined up, no safety net of any kind. What he had was a set of engineering skills, a philosophy about how things ought to be made, and the conviction that a country growing as fast as America was growing would have room for a man who could build something that worked. He was not wrong. Chicago in 1891 was one of the most extraordinary cities on earth, and not in any polished or comfortable sense. It was extraordinary in its raw energy, its scale, its appetite, and its noise. The city had burned to the ground in 1871, the Great Fire, that destroyed more than 17,000 buildings and left 100,000 people homeless. Most cities would have spent a generation recovering. Chicago spent a decade rebuilding itself into something larger and more ambitious than what had burned. By 1890, it was the second largest city in America, with more than 1 million residents, and it was growing so fast that the infrastructure could barely keep up with the people flooding in. The stockyards processed more cattle and hogs than anywhere else in the world. The grain elevators along the Chicago River held enough wheat to feed entire nations. The railroads that converged on Chicago from every direction made it the commercial hub of the continent. Everything that moved between the farms of the Midwest and the ports of the East Coast passed through Chicago, and the city had grown rich on its percentage of all that movement. The factories were everywhere. They made steel, furniture, candy, clothing, printing presses, agricultural equipment, and, increasingly, bicycles. Chicago's manufacturing sector employed hundreds of thousands of workers, most of them immigrants. Most of them working long hours for wages that were modest by any standard but represented, for people who had come from the poverty of rural Europe, a genuine improvement over what they had left. This was the world Ignaz Schwinn entered. He spoke accented English and knew almost no one. He found work in Chicago's bicycle industry, not as an owner, not even as a foreman, but as a skilled mechanic, and eventually an engineer in other men's shops. He spent several years doing this. Some accounts suggest he worked for as many as 3 different bicycle manufacturers during this period. He was not marking time. He was studying. He was learning the American market, what customers wanted, what price they would pay, what complaints they brought back to dealers. He was learning American manufacturing methods, where they were efficient, where they cut corners, where they failed. And he was learning Chicago, the suppliers, the investors, the dealers, the neighborhoods, the social networks that connected German-American businessmen to one another, and to the broader commercial life of the city. By 1895, he had saved some money, accumulated considerable knowledge, and identified a partner who had what he lacked: capital and Chicago connections. Adolf Arnold was a businessman with money to invest and the good sense to recognize engineering talent when he encountered it. The arrangement between them was clean and direct. Arnold would provide the financing and the business relationships. Schwinn would provide the manufacturing expertise and the quality control. They would split the company between them and build something neither could build alone. On October 22, 1895, Arnold, Schwinn and Company opened for business on Chicago's North Side. The bicycle mania that was sweeping America at that moment gave them a market. Ignaz's philosophy gave them a product worth making. To appreciate what Ignaz Schwinn was stepping into in 1895, it helps to understand just how completely the bicycle had captured American imagination in that decade. In 1890, approximately 200,000 bicycles were sold in the United States. By 1895, the year Schwinn opened his factory, that number was approaching 1 million. By the peak of the craze in 1897, more than 2 million bicycles were sold in a single year. No consumer product in American history had grown so fast, captured so many buyers so quickly, or generated such a frenzy of commercial activity around it. Every social class wanted bicycles. The wealthy bought them as sporting equipment and status symbols, riding in organized clubs through the parks of cities that were scrambling to build paved paths to accommodate them. The middle class bought them for recreation and for the unprecedented freedom of movement they provided. The working class bought them for transportation. A bicycle could carry a worker to a factory or an office far faster and more cheaply than a horse-drawn streetcar. The impact on women deserves particular attention, because it was genuinely revolutionary in a way that we can easily underestimate looking back at it. In the 1890s, a respectable woman's world was largely defined by the boundaries that convention, and often her husband or father, permitted. Traveling alone, at speed, under your own power, was simply not something women did. A bicycle changed that equation completely. On a bicycle, a woman could go somewhere. She could cover miles without assistance, without a chaperone, without asking anyone's permission. Susan B. Anthony, who had spent decades fighting for women's suffrage and had seen every variety of social change, told a reporter in 1896 that she thought the bicycle had done more for women's emancipation than almost anything else she could name. It was a remarkable statement from a woman who had spent her life fighting for remarkable things. She meant it literally. The bicycle was giving women a kind of physical freedom that translated, in subtle but real ways, into a broader sense of what they were permitted to do and be. The cycling press was enormous. Dozens of magazines devoted entirely to bicycling were published in the 1890s. Bicycle clubs organized rides, races, tours, and social events. The League of American Wheelmen, the main cycling advocacy organization, lobbied aggressively for paved roads and became one of the most politically influential recreational organizations in the country. The Good Roads movement, which eventually led to the interstate highway system, began as a bicycle advocacy effort. Ignaz Schwinn looked at all of this and saw both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity was obvious: a massive, fast-growing market with strong demand at every price point. The problem was equally obvious to anyone who looked closely at the products being sold. Most American bicycles of the 1890s were, by Ignaz's engineering standards, quite poor. Frames were inconsistently welded. Components were made to price points rather than performance standards. Wheels went out of true. Chains slipped. Tires, the solid rubber or early pneumatic tires of that era, failed unpredictably. Riders were getting hurt. Dealers were handling an endless stream of warranty complaints. The industry was selling the dream of cycling faster than it could deliver the reality of a bicycle that actually worked reliably. Ignaz Schwinn saw this as the central business opportunity of his career. Not the bicycle craze itself. Anyone could see that. What he saw was the specific gap between what customers needed and what the market was providing. He intended to fill that gap, and he intended to charge accordingly for doing so. He would not compete on price. He would compete on quality, and he would make quality so obvious, so consistent, and so reliable that customers would choose it over the cheaper alternatives even. When money was tight, from the first week of production, Schwinn imported German steel rather than using the cheaper domestic grades that his competitors favored. He implemented welding techniques that he had learned in German workshops. Techniques that produced stronger joints and more consistent results than what American factories were doing. He tested frames systematically, loading them to failure, studying where and how they broke, and redesigning them to be stronger at those points. His bicycles cost more. They were worth more. And within the close-knit cycling community of 1890s Chicago, where riders talked to each other constantly about equipment, and where a bicycle's reliability was a matter of personal safety as much as convenience, the reputation of Arnold Schwinn and Company spread quickly. By 1900, the company was producing several thousand bicycles per year and had established itself as a manufacturer whose products could be trusted. That reputation, earned through 5 years of keeping promises that the rest of the industry routinely broke, would prove to be more durable than the bicycle craze itself. The collapse of the bicycle boom at the turn of the century was as sudden and dramatic as its rise had been. The automobile arrived, sputtering, unreliable, expensive, and yet undeniably the future, and the cultural moment that had made the bicycle the most exciting thing in American life evaporated almost overnight. Annual bicycle sales fell from more than 2 million at the peak to barely 200,000 by 1905. Dozens of manufacturers who had expanded aggressively during the boom went bankrupt almost immediately. The industry that had seemed invincible in 1897 was, by 1902, a cautionary tale about speculative excess. Most of Schwinn's competitors either failed entirely or survived by becoming shadows of themselves, tiny operations producing a handful of bicycles for a dwindling market of serious enthusiasts. The rational business response to what happened between 1900 and 1910 was to exit the bicycle industry or to dramatically reduce your ambitions within it. Ignaz Schwinn did neither. He looked at the contracted market and made an assessment that his competitors were not making. Yes, the bicycle craze was over. The novelty buyers, the fashion-conscious consumers, the people who had bought bicycles because everyone was buying bicycles, they were gone, and they were not coming back. But a core market remained. Serious cyclists who rode for transportation, enthusiasts who rode for sport and recreation, working people for whom a reliable bicycle was a practical necessity. These buyers were still there, and they were, if anything, more demanding than the casual buyers of the boom years. They knew what they wanted. They knew the difference between a bicycle that performed well and one that didn't. And they would pay for quality if they could find it. Ignaz invested in his factory during these lean years. Rather than pulling back from it, he acquired better equipment. He refined his manufacturing processes. He developed new frame designs that were stronger and lighter than what he had been producing. He filed patents. He hired the best mechanics he could find and paid them enough to keep them the Schwinn standard, a term his workers used among themselves before it ever became official company language, meant that every bicycle that left the North Kostner Avenue factory met a consistent set of specifications. Not approximately met them. A bicycle that fell short went back for rework. No exceptions were made for the pressures of production schedules or the temptations of saving a few dollars per unit. This was not a romantic or sentimental commitment to quality for its own sake. It was a calculated business strategy, and Ignaz understood it as such. In a contracted market where buyers were more sophisticated and more demanding than the boomier customers had been, consistency was a competitive advantage that compounded over time. Every bicycle that performed as promised was an advertisement for the next one. Every dealer who could tell a customer that Schwinn bikes didn't come back for warranty repairs was building a relationship that would last for years. By 1910, Schwinn Bicycle Company had survived the collapse that had eliminated most of its competition. The company was smaller than it had been at the peak of the boom, but it was profitable, it was debt-free, and it occupied a position in the American bicycle market that no surviving competitor could match, the unambiguous quality leader. By 1920, production had climbed back to 50,000 bicycles per year. The factory employed 500 workers. The Schwinn name, through 25 years of keeping its promises, had become synonymous in the American market with quality bicycles in a way that no amount of advertising could have purchased. Then, in 1923, Ignaz Schwinn died at the age of 63. He had spent 28 years in America, building from nothing something that was genuinely his, not just a business, but a standard, a set of values embodied in physical objects that carried his name into the homes of hundreds of thousands of American families. His son Frank, 28 years old, stepped forward to take the company his father had built and do something with it that Ignaz had never quite imagined. Frank Schwinn had grown up inside the factory. As a teenager, he had worked the floor alongside the mechanics and welders who built his father's bicycles. He understood manufacturing from the inside, not as an abstraction or a set of financial metrics, but as a physical process carried out by skilled men using specific tools and techniques that either worked or didn't. But Frank also had something his father had not possessed in the same degree: a salesman's instinct for what people wanted before they knew they wanted it. Where Ignaz had been reactive, identifying a gap between what the market provided and what customers needed, Frank was proactive. He was always thinking about the customer who didn't yet exist, the market that hadn't yet declared itself. The America of the 1920s was being transformed by forces that Frank understood intuitively. The automobile was making cities spread outward. Suburbs were forming around every major metropolitan area, not the dense, close-packed neighborhoods of the industrial city, but spacious developments with single-family houses, front lawns, backyards, and streets quiet enough for children to play in safely. These new suburban families had more disposable income than previous generations of working Americans, and they were spending it on the equipment of middle-class life: refrigerators, radios, automobiles, washing machines. And children. Suburban children who had room to ride bicycles and parents eager to give them the best of everything. Frank Schwinn made the decision that would define the company for the next 4 decades. Schwinn would focus its energy and its innovation on bicycles for children and teenagers. Not cheap, toy-quality bicycles. That market was already crowded with inferior products. Premium bicycles for young people, built to the same standards as Ignaz's adult machines, priced at a level that reflected that quality, and marketed as the best bicycle a child could own. In 1924, the Aerocycle appeared. It was the first bicycle designed specifically for American children that treated them as real riders rather than scaled-down adults. The balloon tires, fat, cushioned, forgiving, were a genuine innovation. They absorbed the bumps and irregularities of unpaved neighborhood streets and gravel driveways. They made riding more comfortable and more stable, which meant that children who might otherwise struggle on a bicycle could ride one successfully and enjoy it. The frame geometry was designed for smaller bodies and lower centers of gravity. The colors: Schwinn introduced multiple color options in an industry that had treated color as an afterthought, or chosen to appeal to children's eyes. And the construction was exactly what Ignaz would have demanded: steel tested to specification, welds inspected, every component verified before the bicycle left the factory. Parents immediately understood what they were buying. A Schwinn bicycle was not a toy that would break by spring. It was a machine that would last through a child's entire childhood, that could be handed down to a younger sibling, that represented an investment rather than an expense, for families with the resources to make that investment. There was no real competition. Sales climbed through the late 1920s as the American economy boomed. Then the Depression arrived, and everything changed, or seemed to. By 1932, 25% of American workers had no job. Families that had been comfortable were suddenly counting every dollar. The conventional response for a consumer goods manufacturer in those circumstances was to cut prices, reduce quality, and try to hold volume by offering a product that more people could afford in desperate times. Frank Schwinn refused. He maintained his prices and his standards. He reasoned, and events would prove him right, that a family under economic pressure could not afford to make a bad purchase. If they spent their carefully saved money on a bicycle that lasted 5 years, that was value. If they saved a few dollars on a bicycle that broke in a year and needed to be replaced, they had spent more in the end, and they had nothing to show for the hard years in between. The Schwinn bicycle, Frank argued in his own mind and to his dealers, was actually the more economical choice even at a higher price. Enough families agreed with him to keep the factory running profitably through the entire Depression decade. While unemployment devastated the country around them, the workers of North Costner Avenue kept their jobs. Frank also used the Depression years to build something that would prove as valuable as any bicycle he ever made: the dealer network. He traveled personally to bicycle shops across the country, meeting owners, understanding their businesses, offering them exclusive territorial arrangements that gave them genuine incentive to invest in the Schwinn brand. A Schwinn dealer didn't just stock the product, they learned it, believed in it, and sold it with the conviction of someone who had a real stake in its success. In return, they got exclusive rights to the brand in their territory, and a margin that rewarded their loyalty. By 1940, 15 years after Frank had taken over from his father, Schwinn Bicycle Company held approximately 25% of all bicycle sales in the United States. 1 in every 4 bicycles sold in America carried the Schwinn name. That was a remarkable achievement for a single family-owned company competing against dozens of manufacturers. It was built on Igneza's quality foundation and Frank's marketing vision, and it was about to be tested by the largest event of the 20th century. The Second World War temporarily halted bicycle production at North Costner Avenue. As it halted the civilian production of virtually every American factory, the plant converted to war manufacturing. The precise nature of the contracts was never fully publicized, but the machinery that it built bicycles was now contributing to the industrial effort that would eventually end the war. When the factory converted back to bicycle production in 1945, it was stepping into a country that had been profoundly transformed by what it had just been through. The America of 1945 was simultaneously exhausted and electric with possibility. The men who came home had seen things in the Pacific and Europe, in North Africa, that no one who hadn't been there could fully imagine. They had also discovered, many of them for the first time, what it felt like to be part of something larger than themselves, to work alongside men from every state and background toward a common purpose. They had won the largest war in human history. They were ready to come home and build something, and build they did. The post-war economic expansion that began in 1945 and would continue, with brief interruptions, for the better part of 3 decades, was unlike anything the world had seen. American factories that had been producing weapons and aircraft were converted back to consumer goods. The pent-up demand of families that had been rationing everything for 4 years, gasoline, rubber, meat, consumer electronics, exploded into a buying surge that manufacturers could barely keep pace with. The suburbs grew at a pace that astonished even the developers who were building them. William Levitt began constructing Levittown in Nassau County, New York. In 1947, 17,000 houses built on what had been potato fields, designed for young families who wanted space and safety and the full experience of the American middle-class dream. Similar developments appeared outside every major city: Park Forest, Illinois; Lakewood, California; Westchester, New York; Levittown, Pennsylvania. These neighborhoods had a distinctive character. The streets curved gently to discourage through traffic. The houses were similar enough to create a sense of community, different enough to avoid complete monotony. Every house had a yard. Most had a garage. The streets were safe, truly safe in the way that dense urban neighborhoods simply were not, because there was no industry, no through traffic, no reason for strangers to be there. For a child, this was paradise, and paradise required a bicycle. Frank Schwinn understood this moment with complete clarity, and he met it with the most audacious product introduction of his career: the Black Phantom. The Black Phantom appeared in Schwinn's catalog for 1949, and it was unlike anything the bicycle market had seen before, or arguably since. The frame was painted a deep, lustrous black. The fenders were chrome-plated and polished to a mirror finish. The tires were white-walled, borrowing the automotive styling cue that had become associated with luxury cars. A chrome headlight was mounted on the front fender. A horn, operated by a lever on the handlebars, was integrated into the design. Every detail announced that this was not a bicycle. This was an event. The price was $75 at a time when a basic bicycle cost $30. Adjusted for inflation, that would represent several $100s today. By the standards of 1949, it was a luxury purchase. It sold out immediately. Parents who had grown up during the Depression, who knew, in their bodies and their memories, what it felt like to go without, were determined that their children would not know that feeling. The Black Phantom was the best bicycle money could buy, and these parents were determined to give their children the best. The waiting lists at Schwinn dealers stretched for weeks. The bicycle appeared in mail-order catalogs surrounded by language that emphasized its exclusivity. Hollywood put it on screen as the bicycle of choice for children in comfortable homes. It became, in the cultural vocabulary of American childhood, a marker. The family that had a Black Phantom in the garage was a family that had made it. The Phantom launched a decade and a half of Schwinn product innovation that read like a catalog of American aspirations. The Corvette, introduced in 1954, was aimed at teenagers who wanted something sportier than the classic balloon tire. Cruiser, a lighter machine, with a more sophisticated silhouette that borrowed its name from the sports car General Motors had introduced the previous year. The Jaguar, the Continental, the Paramount, each name evoked something fast, refined, and desirable. The Varsity 10-Speed, which appeared in 1960, addressed a segment of the market that Schwinn had not previously served with a dedicated product, the serious recreational cyclist, who wanted to cover real distance efficiently. The 10-speed derailleur bicycle was not a new concept. European cyclists had been riding them for decades, but the Varsity brought it to the American MASS market at a price that serious riders could actually afford. It became the bicycle of the serious teenager, the college student, the adult who had discovered that cycling could be a genuine sport rather than just a pleasant way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Through all of this, the North Costner Avenue factory ran at capacity and sometimes beyond it. The workforce grew. The dealer network expanded. Schwinn's market share, that 25% that Ignaz had achieved and Frank had maintained, held firm through a period of explosive market growth, which meant that the absolute volume of Schwinn bicycles being sold was increasing dramatically even as the percentage stayed constant. By the early 1960s, Schwinn was producing more than 500,000 bicycles per year. The factory ran multiple shifts. Popular models had waiting lists measured in weeks. The company that Ignaz had founded in 1895 with a handshake and a borrowed factory was, by any measure, one of the great American manufacturing success stories. And then came 1963, and the bicycle that would define American childhood for 20 years, the Stingray, didn't just sell bicycles, it sold belonging. And in the America of 1963, belonging was everything. The origin of the Stingray has been told various ways over the years, but the essential story is consistent. Someone at Schwinn, the credit is most commonly given to a product developer named Al Fritz. Though others claimed a role, notice something happening in California. In the beach communities of Los Angeles and San Diego, teenagers were customizing old clunker bicycles in a distinctive way, cutting frames down, installing small wheels, pushing handlebars up as high as they would go, adding long narrow seats. The resulting machines looked, as much as possible, like the motorcycles these teenagers were not yet old enough to legally ride. The custom bikes were crude and improvised, but the impulse behind them was real and strong. Young people wanted a bicycle that expressed their identity, that looked cool, that connected them to the motorcycle culture that dominated teenage aspirations in the early 1960s. Marlon Brando in The Wild One, James Dean on a motorcycle. The whole leather jacket mythology that teenagers were absorbing from movies and music. Al Fritz brought photographs of these California customs back to Chicago and made a proposal. Schwinn should engineer and manufacture a version of this design, built to Schwinn standards, and sell it as a legitimate product rather than leaving the market to homemade approximations. The Stingray that resulted had a 20-inch rear wheel and a 16-inch front wheel, smaller than standard bicycle wheels, which lowered the center of gravity and made the bike more maneuverable. The banana seat, long, narrow, slightly raised at the rear, was explicitly motorcycle-influenced. The high-rise handlebars swept upward and back toward the rider in a wide arc that put the hands in a natural, comfortable position, while also looking dramatically different from anything else on the market. The bicycle sat low. It looked fast. It was surprisingly capable as a performance machine. The small wheels and low center of gravity made it genuinely good at the kind of riding that children actually did. Quick turns, sudden stops, wheelies. It was, beneath the styling, a well-engineered machine. Schwinn released the Stingray in 1963. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By 1964, it was the best-selling bicycle in America. By 1966, copycat versions had appeared from every major competitor. But the Stingray remained the one that mattered, because it was the Schwinn, the real thing, the original, the one every other version was trying to be. Between 1963 and 1974, Schwinn sold more than 14 million Stingrays and Stingray variants. The bicycle became so dominant in its category that competitors' versions were generically called Stingray-style bikes. The brand name having absorbed its entire product category, the way Kleenex had absorbed facial tissues and Xerox had absorbed photocopying. Consider. Who was riding those 14 million bicycles? The baby boom generation, 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964, was the largest generation the country had ever produced. The oldest boomers were 17 in 1963. The youngest were not yet born, but the heart of the generation, the children born in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, were exactly the right age, at exactly the right moment. They got their Stingrays for Christmas and for birthdays. They rode them to school and to friends' houses, and through the long summer afternoons of suburban childhood that, in memory, seemed to last forever. If you were born in America between 1950 and 1960, there is a very good chance that your clearest childhood memory involves a bicycle. And if it involved a bicycle, there's a reasonable chance it was a Schwinn. The brand had not just captured a market. It had embedded itself in a generation's memory of what it felt like to be young. By 1970, Schwinn was producing more than 1 million bicycles per year. The company still held approximately 25% of the American market. 2,000 workers reported to the factory on North Costner Avenue every morning. Frank Schwinn, now in his mid-70s and beginning to step back from day-to-day management, had built something that his father could only have imagined, a national institution, a brand synonymous with childhood itself, a company that seemed as permanent as the suburbs it had helped define. It was, in retrospect, the peak. And the people inside the company, comfortable at the top of their industry, surrounded by evidence of their own success, were not paying sufficient attention to what was beginning to change. The 1970s were, for America, a decade of profound disorientation. The post-war certainties that had organized the country's self-understanding, endless economic growth, technological optimism, confidence in institutions, the unquestioned assumption that each generation would live better than the one before it, were challenged by events that no one had quite predicted. The Vietnam War divided the country in ways that took decades to heal. The assassinations of the 1960s had shaken confidence in the stability of American political life. Watergate revealed that the highest office in the land was not immune to corruption. The oil embargo of 1973 produced gasoline shortages, long lines at filling stations, and an economic shock that showed Americans, for the first time in a generation, that prosperity was not automatic and infinite. Inflation climbed to levels that had not been seen since the immediate post-war period. The baby boomers, who had grown up in the abundance of the 1950s and the social upheaval of the 1960s, were now entering adulthood in a country that felt uncertain in new ways. They were skeptical of institutions, of corporations, of government, of any authority that claimed to know better than they did what was good for them. They were drawn to experiences that felt authentic and physical and self-directed. They were searching for something that the television suburbs of their childhood had not quite provided. Many of them found cycling. The adult cycling boom of the early 1970s was a genuine cultural phenomenon. The oil crisis made bicycle commuting suddenly practical and even fashionable. Environmental consciousness, another boomer preoccupation, made human-powered transportation an expression of values rather than just a mode of getting from place to place. The fitness culture that would explode in the 1980s was beginning to take shape, and cycling fit neatly into its logic. It was vigorous. It was outdoor. It was quantifiable. Sales of 10-speed bicycles, like Schwinn's own Varsity, surged. For a moment, it seemed as though Schwinn was perfectly positioned to benefit from this new wave of adult cycling enthusiasm. And in the short term, they were. But something else was happening simultaneously. In the hills of Marin County, California, that Schwinn was not positioned to see clearly or take seriously. Marin County sits north of San Francisco across the Golden Gate Bridge. Its hills are steep, its trails are rugged. And in the early 1970s, it was home to a community of cycling enthusiasts who were doing something that looked, from the outside, like organized recklessness. They were taking old, heavy-framed bicycles, the kind that had been built in the 1930s and 1940s, and were still circulating at flea markets and garage sales, for a few dollars, and riding them down unpaved mountain trails at speeds that were genuinely dangerous. They called these bikes clunkers, and the activity was sometimes called clunker riding or bombarding. The cyclists involved were fully aware that they were inventing something, and they approached the invention with the systematic curiosity of engineers. When a component broke, and components broke constantly, they replaced it with something stronger. When a design limitation slowed them down or compromised their control, they modified it. The bicycle that emerged from this iterative process bore little resemblance to the clunker that had started at Dot by the mid-1970s. A small number of craftsmen in the Marin County area were building custom bicycles specifically designed for off-road use. Joe Breeze built 10 handmade mountain bikes in 1977 that are now recognized as the first purpose-built mountain bicycles in history. Gary Fisher, who would later found his own bicycle company, was riding and racing, and pushing the equipment in directions that the cycling industry had never contemplated. Tom Ritchie was building frames. Charlie Kelly was organizing races. A whole subculture was being created, almost entirely outside the awareness of the established bicycle industry. The major manufacturers, Schwinn included, looked at this activity and saw a California eccentricity. Enthusiasts riding old clunkers down hills. It was interesting, perhaps. It was not, in their view, a market. They were catastrophically wrong. Mountain biking was not a California eccentricity. It was the future of recreational cycling in America. And it was moving fast. In 1981, a young company called Specialized introduced the Stump Jumper, the first mass-produced mountain bicycle available through regular retail channels. It had fat knobby tires, a reinforced frame, 18 gears, and everything else that the Marin County enthusiasts had developed through years of trial and error. It was an immediate success. Cyclists who had never ridden off-road discovered that mountain biking offered something road cycling and neighborhood cruising couldn't: genuine adventure, physical challenge, and the sensation of riding through terrain that felt genuinely wild. Cannondale, a Connecticut company that had been making bicycle trailers, pivoted to mountain bikes and brought manufacturing innovations, particularly the use of aluminum frames rather than steel, that made their bicycles significantly lighter than the competition. Trek, the Wisconsin startup that Richard Burke had founded in a barn in 1976, embraced mountain bikes early and built a product line that grew in quality and reputation with every passing year. These companies had something in common beyond their commitment to mountain bikes. They were all young, all hungry, and all genuinely close to the customers they served. Their founders rode bicycles. Their product developers rode the trails where their customers rode. When riders came back with feedback about what wasn't working, someone who understood the feedback from personal experience was there to hear it and act on it. Schwinn, by 1980, was a 90-year-old institution run by a family that had been at the top of its industry for 3 generations. Edward Schwinn Jr., who took over after Frank's death in 1979, was a decent man and a genuine inheritor of the family tradition. He believed in quality. He believed in the Schwinn standard. He believed in the dealer network that his grandfather and great-grandfather had built. What he did not believe in, with sufficient conviction to act on the belief, was the mountain bike. He looked at what was happening in California and concluded that it was a fad, the kind of enthusiast phenomenon that flares brightly and then subsides when the enthusiasts move on to the next thing. Schwinn had survived dozens of such trends over 90 years by staying true to its core products and its core customers. The strategy had worked every time. Why would this be different? The answer was that the mountain bike was not a trend. It was a category. It was a genuinely new kind of bicycle that served a genuinely new kind of riding, and the customers who discovered it did not go back. Once you had ridden a mountain bike on a trail, felt the traction of those wide tires on loose dirt, felt the control that came from lower gearing and stronger brakes, felt the freedom of going places that a road bike simply couldn't go, you did not generally conclude that what you really wanted was a 10-speed. Varsity after all, mountain bikers were loyal to mountain bikes, and to the brands that built them well. Trek and Specialized and Cannondale were building them well. Schwinn, when it finally released mountain bike models in the early 1980s, built them inadequately, caught between its premium pricing tradition and the competitive pressure to offer something that worked, and satisfying neither goal. The Schwinn mountain bikes of the early 1980s were not bad bicycles in any absolute sense. By the standards of what Ignaz had built in 1895, they were fine machines. But the standard had changed. The customers comparing Schwinn's mountain bikes were not comparing them to 1895 standards. They were comparing them to what Specialized and Trek and Cannondale were producing. And by that comparison, Schwinn's offerings were overpriced, underspecified, and, most damning, the product of a company that clearly didn't fully understand or love what it was making. Serious mountain bikers could tell the difference. They went elsewhere. While Edward Schwinn Jr. was failing to respond adequately to the mountain bike revolution, a separate crisis was developing that would prove equally destructive. The manufacturing crisis that no amount of product innovation could have fully overcome. Once it was underway, the economics of American manufacturing changed fundamentally between 1970 and 1985. Labor costs rose. Environmental regulations added compliance expenses. The factory infrastructure that had been built in the industrial boom of the early 20th century was aging and increasingly expensive to maintain and upgrade. Meanwhile, manufacturers in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea were producing bicycles and bicycle components at a fraction of what it cost to make them in Chicago. This was not unique to Schwinn or to the bicycle industry. American manufacturers in steel, consumer electronics, textiles, and dozens of other sectors faced the same challenge. Some found ways to adapt by moving production overseas while maintaining design and quality control at home, by focusing on premium segments where American manufacturing still commanded a price premium, by investing in automation that reduced the labor cost disadvantage. Others did not adapt, and they failed. Schwinn's competitors in the bicycle industry made a clear decision early in this transition. Trek, Specialized, and Cannondale all moved significant portions of their production to Taiwan in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They did not do this carelessly. They invested in supplier relationships, quality control processes, and inspection systems that maintained the standards their customers expected. The move abroad reduced their costs substantially, which gave them the margin to invest in product development and marketing that kept them competitive and growing. Edward Schwinn Jr. could not make that decision cleanly. The North Costner Avenue factory was not just a building. It was the physical location of everything the Schwinn family had ever been. Ignaz had built it. Frank had expanded it. 2,000 Chicago workers, real people with families and mortgages and decades of service to the company, depended on it. Closing it felt to Edward like a betrayal of everything his family stood for, a repudiation of the identity that had made Schwinn Schwinn. So he compromised. Schwinn would maintain the Chicago factory for its premium products, while contracting offshore production for lower-end models. This would, in theory, give the company the cost advantages of overseas manufacturing where it needed them most, while preserving the American manufacturing identity that the brand had always claimed. In practice, the compromise served neither goal. The Chicago factory, running at reduced volume, was more expensive per unit to operate than it had ever been. The fixed costs, building maintenance, equipment depreciation, the overhead of running a large industrial facility were spread over fewer units, which drove the cost per bicycle upward even as the factory was supposed to be reducing costs. The overseas models, meanwhile, were produced at prices that reflected the lower labor costs, but were not low enough to compete aggressively at the true budget end of the market, where mass-market retailers were beginning to stock Chinese-made bicycles at prices that Schwinn's overseas suppliers couldn't match. Schwinn was stranded in the middle, too expensive to compete at the bottom, insufficiently innovative to justify premium prices at the top, then the giant. Disaster. Schwinn had contracted with a Taiwanese manufacturer called Giant Bicycle to produce some of its lower-end models. Giant was a capable manufacturer, and under the arrangement they learned, at Schwinn's expense, and under Schwinn's supervision, a great deal about producing bicycles to a consistent quality standard. They absorbed manufacturing knowledge, process improvements, and quality techniques that Schwinn had developed and paid for over decades. In 1980, Schwinn and Giant fell into a dispute over payment terms. The accounts differ on the precise details. Some versions suggest Schwinn was slow to pay invoices. Others that the disagreement was over contract terms, but the outcome was the same. The relationship collapsed. Giant terminated the contract, and then Giant Bicycle did something that should have been anticipated but apparently was not. They went into business for themselves. They had the factory capacity. They had the technical knowledge. They had the quality standards. What they did not have was a brand, but brands can be built, and Giant set about building one, using everything they had learned while producing bicycles for Schwinn. Giant Bicycle today is one of the largest bicycle manufacturers in the world. With annual revenues in the billions of dollars, their products are sold under their own name and manufactured for dozens of other brands. The expertise that launched them into direct competition with established brands was acquired, in significant part through their years as Schwinn's contractor. The lesson that you do not teach a potential competitor everything you know about your business without consequences is one that Schwinn paid for with its existence. With Giant gone, Schwinn scrambled to establish new manufacturing relationships in Taiwan and elsewhere. They found suppliers, but the relationships were newer. The quality consistency was harder to maintain, and the cost structure was no better than what Giant had provided. Meanwhile, the Chicago factory continued to hemorrhage money, and the debt load that had been accumulating began to reach levels that could not be serviced from operating cash flow. Edward tried everything he could think of. New models were introduced. Pricing was adjusted, sometimes upward to reclaim the premium positioning that the brand had always occupied, sometimes downward to try to compete for volume that was going to trek and specialize. Neither direction worked, because neither addressed the fundamental problem. Schwinn's cost structure was incompatible with its market position, and its products had fallen behind the competitive standard in the categories that mattered most. Each year through the mid to late 1980s brought new losses and new attempts to stop the bleeding with measures that were not equal to the wound. The dealer network, those loyal independent bicycle shops that Frank had built with such care over the Depression decade, began quietly expanding their relationships with Trek and Specialized in Cannondale. The dealers had not stopped believing in the Schwinn tradition. They had simply recognized that their customers were asking for products that Schwinn was not providing. In 1988, Schwinn reported its first loss in 93 years of continuous operation. The number was not small. The shock inside the company was genuine. Something that had always seemed impossible had happened, and the people who might have prevented it were still not quite able to see what had to be done. By 1991, the debt exceeded $80 million. The factory had laid off most of its workers. Production had fallen to a fraction of its historical peak. The Schwinn name, which had once been the automatic first choice of parents shopping for their children's bicycles, now competed on dealer floors against brands that were clearly superior in the categories where growth was happening. The bankruptcy filing came on a quiet autumn day in 1992. 97 years. 5 generations. A German immigrant's vision, and his family's century of effort. And it ended with paperwork filed in a federal courthouse. The factory on North Costner Avenue went silent. The machinery was auctioned to pay what could be paid to the creditors who were owed what could not be fully paid. The workers who had built Schwinn bicycles for decades, some of them the children and grandchildren of workers who had built Schwinn bicycles for Frank, for Ignaz, found themselves without jobs in a neighborhood that was already struggling. The brand was sold. Not for what it was worth in its prime, not for anything close to that. The Schwinn name was purchased by Scott Sports Group for approximately $40 million. A sum that covered a fraction of the debt. It changed hands again. And again. It eventually landed with a Canadian conglomerate called Doral Industries, which continues to own it today. The bicycles manufactured under the Schwinn name today are made in China and Taiwan. They are sold through Walmart and Target and large sporting goods chains. They are inexpensive, basic bicycles that compete in the low to mid-price segment of the market. They are not what the Schwinn standard demanded. They are not what Ignaz Schwinn built his reputation on. They bear his name, and that is where the connection to anything he created ends. The dealer network is gone, those independent bicycle shops that Frank had cultivated through the Depression, that had carried the brand through the post-war boom. That had been the primary reason Schwinn's reputation was so durable for so long. Independent bicycle shops still exist across the country, and many of them are excellent, but they sell Trek, Specialized, Cannondale, Giant, and a dozen other brands. They do not sell Schwinn. There is nothing in the current Schwinn product line that would interest their customers. The 25% market share that had seemed so permanent, that 1 in 4 figure that had held through booms and busts and wars and cultural upheavals for nearly 4 decades, is a memory, a historical fact mentioned in business school case studies. The temptation, when looking back at the collapse of Schwinn Bicycle Company, is to turn it into a simple morality tale. Here is what arrogance looks like. Here is what stubbornness costs. Here is the inevitable punishment for refusing to change. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and the parts it leaves out matter. What Ignaz Schwinn built was genuinely excellent. His commitment to quality over cost-cutting, to consistency over convenience, to building something that worked rather than something that merely sold. These were not failures of imagination or courage. They were the principles that kept his company alive through the bicycle bust of the early 1900s, through the Great Depression, through conditions that eliminated virtually every competitor he had. What Frank Schwinn built on that foundation was equally impressive. His insight about suburban families and children's bicycles, his development of the dealer network, his stubbornness about maintaining standards during the Depression, these were the decisions of a genuinely gifted businessman who understood his market and served it with intelligence and integrity. The collapse was not the inevitable consequence of who they were or what they built. It was the consequence of specific decisions made in specific circumstances, decisions that could have been made differently, that were made differently by competitors who faced the same circumstances. Trek Bicycle Corporation is the proof. Richard Burke founded Trek in 1976, with no brand recognition, no dealer network, no manufacturing infrastructure, and no family tradition to draw on. He had a barn, some capital, and a clear-eyed assessment of where the market was going. He embraced mountain bikes when they were still being dismissed by established manufacturers. He moved production to Taiwan while maintaining quality standards that his customers could trust. He built relationships with the next generation of cyclists, rather than waiting for them to discover the brand their parents had ridden. Today, Trek sells bicycles in more than 90 countries. The Burke family still owns the company. Annual revenues exceed $1 billion. The company that Schwinn dismissed as a minor regional competitor is now one of the largest bicycle companies in the world. The difference between Schwinn's fate and Trek's was not resources. Schwinn had more of every resource that matters: capital, brand recognition, manufacturing expertise, dealer relationships, than Trek had at any point. During the critical decade of the 1980s, the difference was the ability to look honestly at the world as it was changing, and to make decisions that served the company's future rather than its past. Edward Schwinn Jr. could not do that. Part of the reason was personal. He was formed so completely by the company's history that he could not easily see past it. But part of the reason was structural. A family business in its 4th generation that has succeeded spectacularly by doing the same things the same ways builds enormous internal resistance to change. Every success becomes an argument for staying the course. Every long-tenured employee, every loyal dealer, every institutional relationship is a constituency for the status quo. The person who wants to change fundamentally is arguing against the evidence of every preceding decade. This is not unique to Schwinn. It is one of the most consistent patterns in business history. The companies that dominate an era are often precisely the ones that are least equipped to navigate the transition to the next era. because their dominance was built on capabilities and relationships and habits of mind that fit the world that is ending, rather than the world that is beginning. The lesson is not simply adapt or die, though that is true as far as it goes. The deeper lesson is about the relationship between tradition and rigidity, between honoring what worked and being imprisoned by it. Ignaz Schwind's tradition was not quality for its own sake. His tradition was honest attention to what customers needed and the craft to deliver it consistently. If he had applied that tradition to the mountain bike market of 1978, he would have built excellent mountain bikes, because that was what customers were beginning to need. The tradition was transferable. His successors failed to transfer it. Asterisk. If you go to the corner of North Costner Avenue and Bloomingdale Avenue on Chicago's west side, you can find what remains of the factory Ignaz Schwind built in 1905. The structure is still standing. Brick buildings of that era were built to last, which is its own quiet irony. Parts of it have been converted to other uses. Parts of it sit vacant. The windows are dusty. The loading docks where finished bicycles were loaded onto trucks for delivery to dealers across the country are silent. There is no marker, no historical plaque, no acknowledgement that this building, for 87 years, was where something genuinely American was made, not just bicycles, but the physical embodiment of a family's values, a craftsman's philosophy, a brand's promise. The neighborhood around it has its own history of difficulty and resilience, its own story of industrial decline, and the slow, uneven process of what comes after. The workers who spent their careers in that building were part of a broader Chicago story, of immigrant families and their children and grandchildren, of union wages and factory floors, and the particular dignity that comes from making something real with your hands. All of that is gone from North Costner Avenue. The machinery that made it possible was sold at auction in 1993 to pay a fraction of what the company owed. The workers dispersed to other work, other industries, or retirement. The institutional knowledge, the specific, accumulated. Irreplaceable expertise in building Schwinn bicycles to Schwinn standards, dissolved. Every black phantom that sat under a Christmas tree came from this building. Every stingray that got a wheelie down a suburban street on a summer afternoon. Every varsity that carried a teenager on a training ride, the first stirrings of what would become a lifelong love of the sport. Every Continental that a college student rode across campus in the early morning. Every bicycle that did what it was supposed to do. That lasted through years of hard use, and was still running when it was finally outgrown. They all came from this building, from the hands of workers who took the standard seriously, because the people who set the standard had earned their respect. That deserves to be remembered. The whole of it, the remarkable achievement and the unnecessary failure, the craftsmanship and the stubbornness, the vision and the blindness. The full story, not just the parts that fit neatly into the lesson we want to take from it. Ignaz Schwind came to America in 1891, carrying a philosophy about how things ought to be made. He found a country that rewarded that philosophy and a market that needed it. He spent 28 years building something worthy of both. His descendants kept faith with what he built for a very long time. Longer than most institutions keep faith with anything. When that faith finally broke, when the commitment to the standard was replaced by commitment to the tradition of the standard, which is a different and lesser thing, the building on North Costner Avenue fell silent. The bicycles still exist. The ones built well, in the decades when the standard meant something, they're still out there. In attics and garages and storage units, in the hands of collectors who recognize what they are, in the memories of everyone who ever received one as a gift and understood, in the way children understand things that matter, that they had been given something real. That is what Ignaz Schwind came to America to build. He built it. For a long time his family built it after him. What we make of the rest of the story is up to us. Asterisk.